All right, good morning, everybody. Coming live to you again from the State Department of Education here in Idaho. Want to make sure that everybody knows how grateful I am that you could all make it today. So welcome back to our communities of practice. We have a huge lineup for you today. So I'm going to turn off my video because I'll be presenting a video recording later here. And I've got some help today. I wanted to welcome Will Spoya, who's helping me here from my group, to help admit everyone and to monitor the chat for me. And make sure folks stay muted unless they're asking questions. We also have many counterparts from our other federal programs groups standing by who are also on and will help in some of the presentations today. So this is a big topic around the country right now, this whole fiscal funding cliff. So as we get going here, and I am just kind of buying some more time because a whole bunch of people are getting admitted, but really it's a big topic around the whole country. And so we wanted to make sure that we start addressing this sooner than later, but as soon as we could, because we know you guys are in the thick of budget season. So with that, I think we are pretty close to admitting just about everyone, and we'll continue to do so. Just a reminder, all of these are recorded, and we will be getting those posted as soon as we can with another link and email kind of as a follow-up, where we will also try to make sure that we address any other questions that come in either in the chat or at the end or even after that people email into us. Your questions are super important, so please don't hesitate to let us know what those are. Okay, and I just want to double check everybody's recording. I think we're good to go. Okay, so let's get started, everybody. So remember what a community of practice is. This is a group where you get to share concerns. I get to share concerns. We get to all talk about things that we don't want to lose track of. So please make sure that if you can't attend, you watch the recording or you go and do a deeper dive. We've split these different sections of what we report on to you each month so that you guys can go through and just look up the mini topic. If you just want to see that intro to Edgar, you just wanted to see that GEPA presentation, we have it split out. You can search by it. So we're continuing to try and update those processes so you guys can find those resources. Okay, so federal fiscal grants, communities of practice. Why are we doing this? Well, we're trying to lead with courage, strategy, and confidence. It's super important to us to make sure that you guys have the resources and have that knowledge foundation so that you guys can lead with strategy and confidence. Okay, our agenda is huge today. What's on your radar? We're going to do that. We're going to talk about a quick recap from last month. We're going to go look at some updates on the federal funding horizon, and Kathy Gobby will help us with that. We're going to talk about the federal funding cliff once upon a time. I have a story to tell, and I hope you'll all enjoy it. And then we're going to talk about some of those funds that are ending and the whole fiscal cliff and how that works into your spending plan, how you need to realign your budgets when some of those pandemic funds end. We're going to talk about in-depth analysis, why it's necessary. And we are honored also to have a recorded presentation from Lake Pend Oreille about budget planning and process and some of the things you may not have thought about that could help you as you continue in on your budgeting. All right, so many of you also may have noticed that I canceled the communities of practice. That was on accident. I will give you the caveat that today is going to be a very busy agenda. We may end up going over. If you have to leave, I understand. Just know the full recording will get posted, but we have a bunch of content. Okay, so my favorite here, let's go to what's on your radar. I've got a link here that will be in the presentation. This is what's still left for February. And I would make sure that you guys always look at that due date and then always look again, what is it that I'm doing and why is it required? Is it required by federal law, by state statute? What's it for? Something to think about that's still due, it's not quite due, you have a little bit more time. A couple days is that last item. Everything else is already supposed to be submitted. But on that note, there are some very specifics that you need to pay attention to regarding this, this data for the 26th. And I wanted Sarah Seamont to pop in and give some insight to that and why it's so important. So Sarah, if you're there.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can. There's a little bit of an echo, but I can hear you.
I am muted.
There we go.
Okay, can you hear me now? We're going through the computer, a different computer.
Absolutely. You sound great.
Okay, perfect. So in the past, we used to pull our funding numbers out of MSIS at the end of February. We've left that deadline in because it's great for districts to have all their data current and up to the minute by the end of February, but we actually now pull that in March in order to allow the March IC upload. So it is critically important that districts have all of their MSIS data current and accurate by the end of March when we pull those numbers out. And that includes priority for services, which if you're a migrant funded district, you'll know what that means. And the reason we now wait until the end of March is for students who have enrolled since the last IC upload. Students who enrolled in school are funded at double the amount of those who are not, like preschool and out of school youth who are not enrolled in school. And so it's just really critical to have those, all those data points completed. And part of the importance of that is once we pull those funding numbers, we can't change. Once we've said this is what everybody's getting, I can't get that money back from other districts if something got forgotten. If you didn't include any of your PFS numbers, you could take a pretty big hit. And after we've distributed those funds or put them into the funding formula for our CFSGA for the coming year, it's really too late to undo that. So it's just really important that people be aware of those numbers and that they're accurate.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving that insight. And just to note, those comments, that comment column there to the right, we try to put some insight in there for you guys. So yeah, it's federal law, but this is why. And if you ever have questions on that, give us a holler. That's why we also have that SDE contact person listed. Now going forward into March, so what's coming up ahead? If you notice, there's all kinds of stuff coming up. We went back to a really full month. And most of these are federal statutes related. We have to do this, but they equate to something else. And a lot of it is related to the funding, just like Sarah was just saying. Same with IDEA, title, everything. We're going to be looking at all kinds of data sets that you guys provide. So we need those to be accurate and we need them to be on time. So we don't want you to get left out. I want to make sure that you guys see that, you know, there's lots of different things involved between different groups here. We've got a lot from federal programs. Special ed has a couple. And then child nutrition, those lunch eligibility reports, which we use. Again, we're going to use those. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to be using the free and reduced lunch data soon. So again, think about how all of these things equate to something else. And the reason we ask for them is because we need to use them for something. And then we have the tail end of this month before you all get to go on spring break. If you are not going to have an on-site, check in here with Michelle Pereira. It looks like you guys have a self-assessment. All right. Let's do a quick recap. Last month, we did Intro to Edgar. I've got a link to just that little Edgar piece. Again, we broke up those presentations so you can go search just those little pieces. What was the purpose of Edgar? It's to strengthen the oversight and the use of funds. We want to make sure that we don't have waste, fraud, and abuse. So check out that presentation if you missed it. Then we also gave you guys a tips and tricks. We tried to compare special ed maintenance of effort and federal programs maintenance of effort. They're different, but they're similar. So this was our hot sheet for you guys. You can see that the thresholds are different, but the concept's the same. It's what did you spend on a certain program or programs out of your general funds. So take a look at that, read that, and if you have questions, reach out. Then we had another little presentation about food, federal money and food, and when it's good and when it's not so good. And I would say the biggest takeaway is it necessary to carry out the scope of work? And if you see down below, we have the caveat again, and it's in the full presentation. We've got a link to that. But there are certain requirements where it is necessary to the scope of work. And we have that one listed there for Title I-C migrant, because they have those parent advisory councils and things where it could definitely be appropriate. So make sure that if you haven't taken a look at that, that you do. And if you have more questions, we're trying to build a Q&A about all the different questions that come from different angles to the use of funds, federal funds for food. Okay, updates on the federal funding horizon. We are going to be joined here by Kathy Gobby, who is our Interim Director of Federal Programs, and she's going to give us an update here about what's on the horizon from the federal level. All right, Kathy.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We always are interested in what our funding is going to be for the next year. And some of you probably heard rumors that, oh, we're asking for double in some of the federal funds and this and that. However, that was not a reality. We are starting to get preliminary allocations and all. And so we are going to be able to get those out to you, and in order to do some things, there are other things that have to happen first, but know that we should have preliminary allocations for you by the time we go on CFSGA workshop tour, end of April, beginning to mid-May.
All right.
And just a reminder that there was a boost of funding under ESEA, and Lisa will be speaking to the IDEA portion of that, but we're going to go ahead and show you the next slide that shows the various programs, and you'll notice, notice that the president proposed 37, figure of 37, but we got a figure of 19. So you can see that's basically half. And so there was a 4.7% increase, but keep in mind that is the federal level increase. And so the state of Idaho, unfortunately, for the past few years, our amount of fund that we have received from USAID at the state level has been going down because the amount of low income we have has been going down. So even though it says almost a 5% increase there, again, that is at the national level. At the state level, it does not always translate that way. So for your purposes, as always, for your 1A and 2A, probably figure in reality that you can't go below 85% of your current allocation because of the hold harmless clause. Some of you will get very similar to what you've gotten this past year. Some of you, it may go up a bit. Some of it may go down a bit. Again, just a reminder that we'll have preliminary allocations this spring, final then in the fall. And then the difference also has to do with our charter LEAs, because you will be doing your low income projections and turning those in. And then so that affects both the charter allocation and the LEAs who have students in those attendance centers. But I don't want to get down into the weeds on that. But if you have questions individually, reach out to us on that. But you've been given some preliminary information on that. And as Lisa mentioned, off the child nutrition program count, which is mainly collected through IC. And then if you don't have the school lunch program, you'll need to use that other form. But that will be coming up later in the presentation as well.
All right. Thank you so much, Kathy. And yeah, so these numbers, like Kathy said, think about our state and think about how the cost of living has gone up, the cost of housing has gone up. It's a desirable place to be, so therefore a lot of things went up, and it does affect the overall low income rates. So definitely something for us all to consider when with forecasting. Okay, so I made a story for you guys. Now this is called the Federal Funding Cliff, a story of heroic acts by business office staff and program staff. And I want us all to keep this all in perspective. Don't laugh too hard. So once upon a time, there was a whole lot of pandemic grant money. It was raining grant money. It was so exciting because, we got this great response to help us address the pandemic and the needs of the students in our districts. And it was just the good times, right? Rain and money. But then one day the grants began to phase out and we were trying to hold on to that last gold coin before the fiscal cliff came. that there were no more pandemic funds, and we are almost to this point. So what's going to happen at this point? The schools asked, what are we to do? Do we juggle the money? Do we blow up our budgets? Do we try and catch the coins from here and there that might be coming instead of all the dollars? Do we fight over the money? Do we try and find a magic genie lamp? So all these things, what are we going to do? Well, we don't really know what the future of school funding looks like, but what can we do? Well, the LEAs analyzed, they forecasted, and they made a plan. So you guys have data, and we're going to try and help you guys not lose sight of some of the other pieces that might be directly influencing what your future forecasts will look at. And that's what today's all about. We're going to try and put some of those terms in your mind so you can ask your neighbor, your IASBO groups, reach out individually to us on a specific funding stream. You're going to attend Julie Oberle's presentations if you can on state money. All these things matter. So when the LEAs analyzed and forecasted and made a plan, together they saved the day and the districts lived happily ever after. And that's the end of the story. It's not the end of today's story, but that's the end of what we would like to think we could all do and what we are hoping you guys can all come together to do. So in reality, these funds are closing out, right? There's some closeout timing of these pandemic related funds that we also want to make sure you guys are aware of. So the reason we have to timely tie out these grants and have these specific timelines for closeout is due to some CFRs. And here's the one that for the most part applies to most grants. So usually if you know that your grant ends like in September 30th, you have some time in December that you've got to get it to us because that's that 90-day period of closeout. Now, we have a list of some federal funds here that we want to draw attention to because this next fall, September 30th of 2023, there are a couple funding streams that are going to die out. So if you notice, we say that 9/30 is the date you have to obligate by, but we usually give you pretty close to the end of December with Christmas break and everything else and the timeliness of drawdowns and everything else. We do a preliminary final date of 12/15, right? December 15th. So keep in mind, we will still remind you of these dates, but we want them to be on your radar and we want you to be budgeting accordingly. And now the one in the middle here is SLRF. And so this one, I might have Lisa jump in here and talk about because there are exceptions. Sometimes we can't give you extra time because maybe we already did. Lisa, did you want to chime in and have anything to say on that one?
No, there's no liquidation period or anything on those, so we just need to be mindful of that. They will be closed on that date, so make sure you're using those funds. And for the SRSA, ESSER 2, ARP ESSER 3, and those will be probably the liquidation periods will probably be in January of the following year as opposed to December. So just a couple of things there.
Absolutely. And when we put these December dates, we want this to be your target dates. And like we said earlier, we will send out reminders on that. If you can at all close out before, that's always better for you and everyone else, gives us time to tie it out as well. But yeah, absolutely, Lisa, you're right. We do have till January. We just want to make sure that we give you those preliminary dates, make sure that if you have payrolls or anything else that are aligned with that time period, that you get those budgeted accordingly. So, and as Lisa just mentioned too, the lower half of this page, we've got ARPA funds and whatnot that are also going to end in 2024. So just pay attention. All these dates are in the CFSGA, okay? And not the CFSGA, sorry, the GRA. So when you go in there to see your grants, you can always see the dates on those as well. Now, with that, we were talking about budgeting just a minute ago. There are some carryover limitations. So some of your specific funding streams, you can't carry the whole thing over. And I've got a couple of these listed, but check with your grant managers and coordinators to see if you have to provide a request in advance or an explanation, like in the IDEA application. We allow up to 100% carryover, but I don't do it usually more than once for you. So I need that justification of what happened. So make sure you reach out if you are trying to budget a certain strategy of carryover, make sure it's allowable. All right, realigning the budgets. Once these funds ends, what are we going to do? Well, I have some pictures here, and one says, would you rather step off this cliff when you can't even see the bottom, or would you rather be a clear day with a clear view of where you're going to land? So think about that. Try and keep everything in perspective of you're putting together your plan. How are we going to weather this storm? It is a storm because all these funds are blowing out of, and they're going to be gone. So we need to make sure we analyze, forecast, and budget appropriately. Not just for federal funds. I know Julie Oberly talks to you guys about this too. Budgeting is really hard, but the best thing to do is to analyze and forecast. Now, some other insights on budgeting and forecasting is to think about, hey, who's retiring? Who might be moving into another department? What's my enrollment estimate look like? Do I have a huge couple of apartment complexes going in right here in my area? What's going to happen? What is the economic outlook for our state? What's JFAC talking about? What are they projecting? They get to set the appropriations. So it's important to know what's going on there. And are there any other grant funding carryover limitations like we just talked about? What did my budget look like pre-pandemic? This is another huge, huge thing. Okay, now laying out the facts, this is something where it's all hands in, finance and program staff. And I know that the program staff, they're running the programs. They have the insight, okay? They know what's happening. Maybe they know Mary Sue told them last year that next year's her last year and she's going to retire. Or maybe they know that so-and-so, is going to get their master's degree, and that could change something in the pay structure. So think about all these things. Finance and program, you've got to talk. And so it's a together problem, a together analysis, and a together all hands in solution. And let's talk again why in-depth analysis is necessary. We talked kind of in general before, but now I want to kind of dive in about enrollment and low income numbers, okay? So the last 3 years, in case you're new, funding allocations for federal grants were based off of low income enrollment numbers from the 2019 to 2020 school year. Whoa, that's a long time ago. Here we are in 2023. Well, why did this happen? Well, it happened because there was a national school lunch waiver, and that meant we didn't have another means of capturing all the data we needed for low income for our calculations. So what we did is we reached out to all you guys. We had these roundtable discussions. We talked about using direct cert numbers and other census numbers to try and find out how that would affect us all. And as a group of LEAs and all of the analysis that was provided by many of our districts to help us see how that would happen, it just became the best option to freeze what we had in 2019-2020 school year. But what does that mean? What does this mean to me now? Well, what it means is that we are going to receive a snapshot in time in March of 2023 from Child Nutrition, and we're going to use that to apply to some of our federally mandated allocation calculations for various grant funds. And we're also going to be able to revert to the current year, whether it's fall enrollment or a spring enrollment count, depending on funding stream and what we can and cannot apply. We're going to be looking for the most accurate picture of your enrollment. Finally. Okay, now some of the programs I want to tie out in this manner, if you guys are recognized, well, what does this apply to? It definitely applies to Title 1A, Title 2A, and IDEA. And if you know anything about title funding, you know that those allocations and percentages are sometimes used to calculate other grants. They look at how the numbers were on the title funding. So something super huge to look at there and make sure that you don't lose sight of that. All right, and then on the effects of the updated data, you might be the guy on the left, but you might be the lady on the right. There are going to be some winners and some losers, okay? Because some of our LEAs had huge increases to enrollment, and that is going to by far contribute the most, in most cases, to higher allocations, because a lot of our calculations really stem mostly from enrollment, but just depends on the funding stream. But then there's going to be other LEAs who had benefited from the use of those older numbers during the pandemic. Maybe their enrollment really actually was way lower than that, and they benefited from that freeze in time. But everyone's low income rates are going to be all over the place. So you might see a little bit of up or down depending on what has actually happened since and what we have in place to look at here in a couple of weeks when we get ready to do these allocations. Now, the low impact calculation impact is really It depends on the funding stream, but we wanted to tie back to the Every Student Succeeds Act. This is nothing new, has nothing really to do with ESSER or ARPA or anything else. This is a normalcy where at least 35% of the students or the LEA low income equivalent have to be identified as low income to be eligible for Title I. So there's certain provisions that will be looked at, and depending on what your scenario is now, that just needs to be something on your radar. We aren't going to know until we get those numbers, but you might know now. Now, census poverty estimates is another thing. The ESEA requires that LEA's eligibility and allocations under each Title I formula and its allocations for Title II have to be determined in part based on the census LEA poverty estimates. So we get this national data, the census poverty data, but to derive where these special LEAs, which are actually our charters for the most part, we have to know an alternative poverty data source so that we can know where they came from and all those different pieces, so that we can appropriately allocate funds between LEAs. All right, and so Idaho uses child nutrition free and reduced lunch data. That's why we had that frozen in time scenario. We couldn't do anything because we didn't have any data set. So just make sure that you realize how and in what way we are going to be applying different census poverty or low income child nutrition numbers. But for any LEA that does not participate in those CNP low income eligibility forms are going to be available, and we have a link for you here. So not everybody participates in that, we know that, and that shouldn't be anything new to you, but I just want to make sure that you had a link live here so that you would be able to take a look at that as well. Okay. Now, the grandfather clause, we have something with rank and serve in the grandfather clause, and this one isn't my world, but I will allow my federal folks here from federal programs to chime in. But what this really means is there's some exceptions, right? There's a special exception is what it's called in the CFSGA, but it's really grandfathering in if you weren't available or eligible, you get kind of a year extension. So this provision really just applies to a newly ineligible school, not an eligible school that has fallen into the poverty ranking compared to a previous year. But really, this timing of how this all works and the way we had our funds frozen, it may not be intuitive to you. So if you have questions on that, we encourage you to reach out to us here in the federal side. Kathy, did you have anything else, Kathy Gabi, that you wanted to talk about?
Yes, just to add real briefly, we're talking about that Title I-A allocation to schools tab, and I'm turning to Stacy to make sure she's agreeing with what I'm telling you. And then under your rank and serve, and so you'd want to look at that percent low income. And so is the school 35% low income or above, or is it if the LEA average is below that 35%, is it at that district average or above? If so, it's eligible. You're going to mark that eligible and then decide who's being served according to your rank and serve. And that's where we're talking about that special exception. Several of you have reached out already saying, hey, we have some schools that the low income looks like it may be a little bit less. And so that's where we're saying you can use that special exception for 1 year. And then just please add a comment in the comments section so that Stacy and Brian will know that you're using that special exception. And you also mark that with special exception so that we know that's why you're serving that for that additional year. But again, if you have questions on particularly your rank and serve and things, look at the instructions under the allocation to schools tab, and then also feel free to reach out to Stacy and Brian or myself if you have questions on that. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Kathy. And, we're going really high level just to put these ideas in your head. But as many of us will be presenting at the IASBO conference here in early March. I think it's on the 2nd. And in some of those presentations and other presentations that we may do, we'll get a little bit more in the weeds, perhaps, on some of these pieces. But really, let's get back to in-depth analysis. things to think about, just some very high level things. What's my enrollment for this year look like? What was it? How does it compare? And then how about the building level? Because that, again, back to what Kathy was saying, what are those averages? Have I already used that grandfather clause? All of those things are things to keep in mind. And then I have just some best practices. Calculate and recalculate. Run like 20 different scenarios if you need to, because you will need to tell your superintendent why you're trying to do what you're doing when you get ready to do your budget presentation. Now, again, will I have any carryover? Can I blend and braid funds? How can I extend those ESSER funds? Can I spend ESSER on SPED? All those different things. What does my current staffing level look like? When you lose funding that perhaps was funding specific positions, what is the next level look like? Are you looking at a reduction in form? What are the staffing needs going to be look like? Was it meant to be temporary? Some of you guys hired temporary positions. Others didn't. So think about all of that because all of that affects people, right? Okay, so before I go into the last piece of our presentation, which will probably take us just a minute or so over the hour, do we have any other major questions coming into the chat? I see a few. Yep, there's Sarah addressing that. Perfect. Yes, mental health issues are overwhelming currently, and this is a huge funding concern. And that came in from Kendi, I believe. And so just so that you know, we're also trying to keep sight of anything on the federal level or horizon, if there's going to be any other extensions on funding streams, or any other grant programs that may come out to serve specifically for these mental health crises that we're seeing in some areas. Okay. Now, with that, I wanted to thank Lisa Held ahead of time, who can't be with us live, but she took the time to go ahead and do a presentation recording for you all. And for those that don't know her, she is the Chief Financial Operations Officer for Lake Pend Oreille School District. She has been there for a long time, and she has got a plethora of knowledge to share. So for about the next 28 minutes, we are going to listen to a great presentation. It's very in-depth for you guys to help you guys grasp some more of the pieces that you may not have been looking at as you continue on with your budgeting. And then we're going to just recap at the end with some Q&A. I just want to make sure that everyone knows, if you have to drop off, that this still is recorded, and we will take questions after the fact emailed to us as well and try and make sure that we address them all. Okay. Let's see. There you go. Welcome, Lisa.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Halst. I'm the Chief Financial and Operations Officer for Lake Pend Oreille School District. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on public entity budgeting, my approach, my strategy. And when Lisa approached me, I really had to think and distill and convey my practices. You know, what do I do? And I really landed on 3 overarching tacks. So next slide, please. I guess I'll share a little of my background. I have 30 years of public service as a CFO in various public entities in Idaho, spending the last 20 in Lake Pend Oreille School District, which is grounded out of Sandpoint, Idaho. And I feel like I approach public entity budgeting truly as an outgrowth of my higher education, which degrees in public policy and in business. So the first strategy I would suggest is to work with intention. Next strategy I utilize heavily is to ensure you have a command of the law, federal law, state law, even some things at the local level, and to advocate for that, to lobby. And finally, to try to utilize your resources effectively. Slide, please. So what do I mean by working with intention? Your school district, you know, they are going to be looking to you as the CFO for guidance and for strategy. So, you know, Identify who are your stakeholders. Of course, you report directly to your superintendent and your board, but there are other stakeholders and they may vary from one fiscal cycle to the next or could really morph over a period of years. Your staff and Idaho teachers have bargaining rights, parents, but all staff, not just teachers, students, and whatever civic community friends. And then I would really accent foes. You have to be very cognizant of the foes or those that are not involved or really are receiving misinformation. Identify how you're going to communicate to those various stakeholders. Definitely play to your strengths. You know, what is it that you enjoy about your job? How best do you communicate and deliver content to varying sophistication levels of audiences? And you will have that disparate audience, and you need to speak to how they can best digest the materials. Identify what your process is and your timeline. I've now worked under 5 superintendents, and budgeting for me is really an all year long process. You'll see that as we go forward. Of course, with an apex from when the Idaho legislature adjourns in January through January through April. And then really also be cognizant of extraordinary variables. You know, what do I mean by that? That can be at the federal level, again, at the state level, or at the local level. For example, in my 20-year tenure year in Idaho, we had in 2007 what's deemed the property tax revolt, and we're sort of in that again, more on the residential property taxpayer now, which repealed equalization, fundamentally shifted how K-12 public education is funded in Idaho. If you don't know, there used to be $300 per 100,000 of net taxable value that was non-voter approved. Lake Pend Oreille School District, that was 60% of our state annual appropriation. Another example, in 2009, the Great Recession, what happened particularly at the federal level under the Obama administration. First, we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, followed by the Stimulus Act. And we've had several governors that had education task force. The outgrowth of one of those is now, I think we're in our 9th year of the Career Ladder Allocation Module, which singly allocates the largest portion of the annual K-12 budget out to school districts. The onset of COVID, and now yet another 3 ESSER packages that infused millions of dollars into our state. Overall, actually $6 billion, which is equivalent to 1 year of the whole state's annual budget. And then most recently, our 2-day special session, which again, I would argue has fundamentally shifted a big portion potentially of public education going forward, establishing the public income fund. Then on a local level, I could share with you in our district, we had a ballot contest jeopardizing potentially 1/3 of our annual general fund budget. We had a large FCC lawsuit protracted for 5 years. So these are the things you need to ruminate on, and to the best of your ability, inform your superintendent, your board, and strategize. Next slide, please. So I guess I would preface this by saying what I'm saying here today is not exhaustive. It's just meant to serve as a platform for you to build your own unique processes for budgeting. And I would just say right out of the chute, because 90 school districts right now, the brick and mortar school districts have supplemental levies in place. We have an indefinite term supplemental levy. Now we're in our second year, but antecedent to that, I experienced 18 years of every other year going out to the property tax voter, and it's a third of our budget. So the timeline, if we were in a ballot year, we developed our supplemental levy ballot always in the fall, starting by a series of public meetings, and I do probably need like 6 public meetings that span from September to late December. We always want to get the ballot to the county clerk a couple weeks ahead of time in terms of just courtesy to the county clerk. But then I want to start with this presentation with I mentioned earlier, I think budgeting is all year long. And so I'll start with the beginning of the fiscal year, July and August. This is a time when we are sort of boots on the ground, finishing our financial statements and working with our auditors, which then drives whatever carry forward balances we have and our federal final appropriations in the normal year are generally received at the end of August. Also, when it is not an election year, I start monitoring the Joint Finance Appropriation Committee has summer meetings. And I also monitor online if there are any requisite interim legislative funded interim committees and listening to their work session. Then in September, that's when our first big payroll hits our accounting software. And there's always a lot of movement every year of staff. And I always want to make sure that, I've worked closely with HR and that everybody's coded correctly. Just pick that up right after your first big payroll is in your financial software. And then for our school district, generally the first 2 weeks of school is a very good indicator of what our enrollment picture is going to look like. We always try to project enrollment, but we're always going to be wrong, and it's just a matter of magnitude of variance of how wrong we are. And are we going to have to deploy other resources? In our district, we do not budget up to 5% of contingency on an annual basis, which is allowed under Idaho code, but we always budget contingency for deployments, particularly of staff in September. And I strongly recommend that. That saves you. What else? Under Idaho code, every agency head must submit their budget request for the future fiscal year on September 1st. That's something that I look at closely, and as that signals what the priorities are going to be, particularly of the state superintendent. And in my mind, it launches more of the detail work on budget. And then we generally have our audits presented at the end of October. And in a non-election year, generally in October, our school board and some of the key administration, including myself, the superintendent, some teaching and learning leaders, sit down one-to-one with our locally elected officials to paint the picture of what's going on in our district, how we're financially positioned, what our priorities are. And we've also continued that practice during a legislative session where we'll have legislative phone calls. And that also just helps the board and our legislators keep pulse on. We're the largest school district in our county. Next slide, please. Now we move into November. One of the biggest things, of course, that drives our state funding is our midterm support unit count, and you can calculate that with accuracy on your own once you've submitted that in early November. Then one thing that really I know distinguishes my budgeting approach is right after our audit is delivered, I spend the next 2 months going out to all of our schools and all of our department staff to give them essentially a state of the state, financial position, and to sort of foreshadow what I think is going to happen in the upcoming legislative session, and things that they need to be mindful of. While our board meetings are recorded, and I do a fair amount of narrative presentation in our monthly board meetings. Of course, people don't either listen or attend in person, and it's a great opportunity to get to know all of your staff being sort of versus being cloistered in your central office. And your staff then learns you're a real person. You're not sort of little bespectacled bean counter kind of thing. What else happens in November? We in the Senate, myself, but also the superintendent, tasked all of our department heads to give them 60 days to develop a budget request. So we give them that task so November 15th, and they are due 60 days later on January 15th. We don't want our department heads to they need ample time to be thorough in their requests and thoughtful, and 60 days seems reasonable. Then in December, I'm hoping that the federal government has actually adopted their budget, which should have been effective October 1st, but normally there are continuing resolutions that stretch into January and sometimes even into February, because that gives us a first blush at what are the federal appropriations for our next fiscal year going to look like in terms of increase or decrease. And also, this is the month of, at least in our district, we consider we have good free and reduced numbers, which drive different appropriations and also reimbursements. And that's particularly salient. Our largest federal program, probably yours too, is your USDA breakfast, lunch, and maybe kind of after school programs. And all of those reimbursements are solely based on free and reduced counts in meal service. This is also in a non-election year. JFAC starts to meet again and dialoguing about financial position in now 6 months into fiscal year and dialoguing for the next fiscal year. I also find the Association of Taxpayers of Idaho's annual December meeting, some consider it the beginning of the legislative session, helpful. They have a series of economists and some tax specialists that you with discerning ears are listening to what our legislators are listening to. I also try to evaluate if there are now final reports from any of the legislative interim committees, and if there are any Office of Performance Evaluation reports, because all of those are going to feed into what our legislators are listening to and what are the policy planks they're probably going to be considering and the economic conditions that are being presented to them. And then January is a little bit exhausting. I find there are a lot of committees. I spent a ton of time listening to committees on Idaho Legislative Live. I've lost track. Maybe 10 years ago, this became available to us, and it was an absolute game changer versus trying to go through minutes of committee meetings. So I pay attention to the CEC, the Change in Economic Compensation, the EORAC, the Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee. Of course, the governor launches the session with his or her State of the State. When the State of the State is presented, the Legislative Services Offices releases the LBD, the budget book, all the budgets, including ours, which until recently was the largest. Now health and welfare has eclipsed us. Other things, the governor will give an economic forecast. Economic Outlook and Revenue Assessment Committee under code will give a revenue forecast. And then eventually towards the middle of February, JFAC will give an economic forecast. And all of those are helpful to try to determine what my state appropriation is going to be for the next fiscal year. We also convene our insurance committee, our health insurance alone. We have an agent. You know, it's more than 10% of our annual budget. That's probably aligned with most of you listening today. What else goes on in January? I personally set a very hard deadline for myself to come up with a state revenue and federal revenue projection by that last day in January. And that's not easy because all of the variables are generally not in play. One, if you have supplemental levy election. Two, what is your state appropriation going to be? Three, what is your federal appropriation going to be? What is your what is your health insurance? What's going to be the result of your teacher negotiations? But in my opinion, you can't wait. The end of January is when you have to have a very solid revenue projection. And also I mentioned that all of our department heads in mid-January start to present to me on their department requests. That also is heard by our superintendent. And as I said, I'm just monitoring any of the committees that I think can affect the K-12 appropriation, either in this current fiscal cycle or, and I do want to accent this, in future fiscal cycles. You know, the tax and rev and all of those things. Make no mistake, the state income tax and the state sales tax are 80% of the state's annual revenue. Next slide, please. Then if we move into February, also I think sort of something unique to my approach, we have what we call the small budget committee, and we really need to come up with a better name after decades, but it represents all categories of staff. It's chaired by myself. And the mission is to bring a balanced budget request to our superintendent before spring break, which for us is the first week in April. And why is that? We are in a reduction in force for really large program changes as a courtesy to department heads and staff that may be losing their job or being shifted jobs. We want to start that process at the end of March and move through early April. I continue to monitor what's going on at the legislative level. I feel strongly that we're a small state in Idaho, and one voice can really make a difference. I personally know that I have made a difference on legislation by being the technocrat and being able to work with our elected officials to point out, generally it's bad legislation. I'm trying to think if I pointed out good legislation, and days and even sort of hours matter, particularly as the session goes on. Of course, we have the ISBA and some other resources, but we really are the technocrats. We get the nuances that others that are paying attention just don't. It's a complicated funding formula. Also, of course, in February 15th gives us our first actual payments well into the current fiscal year. And for those that aren't quite as confident in their budgeting skills, now they have at least what's going on in this fiscal year, and that can serve as a platform for next fiscal year. If we move into March, that's when, if you have a supplemental levy, that would be determined. And I then start the formal public process of giving my school board a financial overview of the projections by and large on the revenue side. JFAC will by then heard all of the agency budget requests. Will have started the budget setting towards the end of February, and somewhere around March 10th, or sometimes it's been earlier in more recent years, we'll have a good idea of what the K-12 JFAC recommended appropriation is. And there are years when the House and the Senate that it goes back and it's amended. And then sine die is end of March, sometimes early April. April is the month where everything coalesces. We start meeting with our teachers union. We use the interest-based bargaining approach, which has worked very well in our school district. We participate in the statewide health insurance plan. We receive that notification and finalize our health insurance package. And it's our April meeting or meetings in April where we present a draft budget to our school board. And estimated federal appropriations that are released. Here's where I spend a lot of time verbally with high scale presentation, not long financial statements, not 60 pages, not 10 pages. We need, as I said, to really speak to the sophistication level of your audience. And this is also, if we're in a RIF position, we start working with the principals and staff. Our school board gives us the go. Yep, this is what we think is going to be our final adopted budget. We ratified things with the teachers union. And in June, we adopt early June. We don't ever wait till the end of June our budget. Next slide, please. So then I also feel strongly that you are going to be at least the expert on the financial portions of the federal laws that affect all the cadre of your federal programs that your district receives. And that you also need to serve in that role for all the various pieces of Idaho statute. Your superintendent, your school board, your department directors are going to be heavily reliant on your level of expertise here. And, each grant at the federal level has different funding sources and, if A, then B, then C. And then you always have to consider, are these one-time funds? Of course, we're sitting here right now with CRSA, the second federal COVID relief package expiring September 30th of 2023, and then ARPA September 30th, 2024. Massive infusion of money into our school districts. And what's the strategy? In our district, as soon as that money was appropriated, within a month, we had determined how we were going to spend that money through September 30th, 2024. So that worked really well for us, but not suggesting you had to do that, but what's the plan? Final slide. Second to final slide. Please use your resources. You have federal program directors. I'm assuming, unless you're a really small district, and you need to be joined at the hip. You can't start in April talking about what's going to happen to that federal program, right? It's this enormous domino effect. Just because you're paid from a different, right? Everything is going to kind of ebb and flow with your major general fund. If you don't work with the Legislative Services Office, their primary duties are to the elected officials, but they are very helpful. There is a K-12 analyst annually under the governor's office, the Division of Financial Management. They're also very helpful. Alex Adams. I would suggest you want to get to know these people personally, and you can in Idaho. I can tell you that. Of course, your superintendent, the State Department of Education over the last 20 years has worked so hard to have a lot more resources, particularly available online, and templates for you to help calculate your budgets. And then webinars like this. The State Board, the Association of School Administrators, elected officials are your conduits to what could or could not happen with state appropriations, and sometimes on the federal level, particularly You know, we're a big benefactor of federal forest dollars and working with our state elected senators. When that was being repealed, I had mentioned the Association of Taxpayers of Idaho, the National Association, ASBO, of course, we do have our local state association, IASBO, and the Idaho School Boards Association. You know, all of them are feeding through emails, but you know, it just behooves you to have your go-to people, and those go-to people, the last bullet, are your colleagues. Now, there are some of us that have been here a while, and then lots of us, particularly right now, that are brand new and don't sit there sort of ruminating, perseverating, worried. Ask for help. That's what we're here for. Final slide. So you may not have taken the job because you wanted to be a civil servant. You know, you just had a financial background and interest in that. But honestly, I don't think you can extricate yourself from that role. And I would ask in closing that you be a good civil servant. It'll just make your job satisfaction, if for nothing else, a lot higher. Thank you.
All right, everybody. A big thanks and shout out to Lisa Howes from Lake Pend Oreille. I have a slide here to that the legislative budget book that she spoke about. And for your tips and tricks, I'm going to take all of those components that Lisa mentioned for suggestions for budgeting timelines and some of the things you may not have thought about. And then I also have a link to the legislative committee calendars that she spoke of. If you've not gone into the Idaho in session, it is definitely worth your while. There are minutes in there as well, but if you can listen in the background, super helpful. I know we've gone a minute over, but again, this was Lisa's slide about some of those other programs. So don't lose sight of all these resources. You guys are a team. It is a team effort statewide. So I know we're over, but and some folks have had to drop out, but I do want to leave this open. If anybody has any other questions, they want to unmute, they want to get in the chat, or you can feel free to email those to me. Today was a whole lot of information. And, you know, it's not us trying to tell you how to do something. It's us trying to make sure you don't lose sight of anything. Have those big talking points, talk to your superintendents about the things that are these big buzzwords we talked about, because, you know, you're going to need to be able to present that to the appropriate audiences. You'll need to be able to share those things with your program directors as well. If anybody wants to unmute, I'm going to try and be quiet here for a minute. Just reminding you that this is your chance. And if you don't want to hear, you can always send us a message privately and we'll try and address that as well. Just a couple minutes. Guys are so shy. Don't be shy. And Lisa Howes had that point. Ask each other. While you're thinking, and please still unmute if you want to. Here's our information. This was the whole federal programs team. And here's some special eds folks. There will be, Cindy, you asked, you didn't see a link to the slides. You will see a link to the slides. I'm going to break it up because this had this presentation we recorded embedded in it. So it's quite large, but it will be on the Fiscal Grant Communities of Practice page, and I'll send out an email that will give you that link. I hope to have that up later today or tomorrow. And then I said, let's see you next month. We're going to talk a lot about budget presentation to your board and how do you speak to these things to the right groups and make it so that it means something and that they can understand and that it's meaningful, right? You've got to be able to tell that story. And then for those of you who are going to attend the IASBO on March 2nd, there will be many of us from the State Department of Ed that will be there doing other presentations. Please feel free to reach out to us there live and or in between. We will be getting in the weeds on some of these different things when we're doing those presentations. But again, I don't see a lot of questions coming in. I hate to not have you guys chiming in. Next month will be a lot more quiet space, so please save up those questions about specific things for that as well. And in the meantime, I will see you guys next month, and I thank you so much for your time today, and a huge thank you for what you do for students in Idaho. Everybody, you have a great day.